Episode 1. The night the choir began to sing. They say a church should be silent when abandoned, but silence was the one thing St. Aurelia's never kept. I first heard it on a night when the rain clung to the windows like desperate fingers. I was walking past the old chapel, its roof half collapsed, its windows black with rot. People in town swore no priest had served there in 50 years, and yet, from within those crumbling walls, a hymn rose, clear, unbroken, holy. It should have been comforting. It wasn't. The voices weren't like human voices. They didn't breathe between verses, didn't tremble or break. They layered together in perfect harmony, but every note carried something wrong, a weight, a grief that pressed against my chest until my ribs ached. I pushed the heavy wooden doors open. The air inside smelled of wet stone and ashes. The pews were shattered, and mold clung to the altar cloth like a second skin. And there, from the choir loft above, came the sound. Dozens of voices rising, falling, swelling into a hymn I didn't recognize. I looked up. They were standing there, rows of robed figures, pale as bone, their hands clasped like saints at prayer. But where their faces should have been, only blank skin, smooth, featureless, no eyes, no mouths. Yet the hymn poured from them, echoing like it came from the hollow belly of the earth. I couldn't move, my body locked between terror and awe. Then one of them turned toward me, not with eyes, for it had none, but with the tilt of its faceless head, and as it shifted, the song bent. A single note stretched, cracked, and then split into words. My name. Whispered, sung, carved into sound itself. Every instinct screamed for me to run, but I was caught in that melody, like chains of glass, beautiful and sharp. My knees buckled, and I fell against the pew. The hymn swelled louder, shaking dust from the rafters. And in that suffocating chorus I realized something. They weren't singing for God. They were singing for me. The walls trembled. The crucifix above the altar groaned, wood splintering as though the weight of their voices was too much for it to bear. My ears burned, my pulse thundered in time with the music, and still my name unraveled in their song. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence was a wound deeper than the hymn itself. I blinked, gasped, clutching my throat, and when I looked up, the choir loft was empty. No robed figures, no faceless singers, only the lingering taste of their voices in my bones. But I swear to you, even as I stumbled back into the night, the rain masking my tears, the song followed, not through the air, not from the church, but from inside me. And I knew with a terror that would never leave that the choir had chosen me. Episode 2. The priest who covered his ears. I thought I was the first to hear them. I was wrong. The old priest had been waiting for me, though I didn't know it yet. His name was Father Mercier, a man so ancient his skin seemed carved from candle wax. He lived in a cottage by the woods, away from the town, away from the church. People said he'd gone half mad years ago, whispering sermons to no one, wearing rosaries that rattled like chains. I found him after the night I heard the faceless choir. My curiosity, no, my terror, drove me to him. They said he once served at St. Aurelia's, before it was abandoned. When I knocked, he didn't open. He shouted through the door, his voice cracked, ragged. You heard them, didn't you? The hairs on my arms rose. I hadn't spoken a word. The door creaked open. His eyes were clouded, almost blind, yet they seemed to see straight into me. He grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. His nails dug into my skin as he pulled me inside. Don't listen, he hissed. Don't ever listen. The cottage was filled with crucifixes, on the walls, on the floor, even nailed into the table. But none of them bore Christ's figure. They were empty crosses, stripped of their Savior, as if he had abandoned them long ago. Father Mercier trembled as he spoke. They sang to me too, long before you. Their hymn isn't music, it's confession. Every note is a soul, a sin, a cry from the grave. I whispered, my throat dry. But they don't have mouths. His face twisted with terror, like a child recalling a nightmare. That's the horror. Their song doesn't need mouths. It pours from what they lost, their silence. It deafened me. Boy, do you see? And then he pulled back the tufts of his thin white hair. His ears, scarred, shriveled, sealed with wax like melted candle stubs. He had taken holy wax, poured it into his ears until it burned the flesh shut. I made myself deaf, he said, voice breaking. It was the only way to keep them from living inside me. Because once their hymn settles in your bones, it never leaves. Never. I staggered back, my stomach twisting, his blindness, his shaking hands, the empty crucifixes. It was all the wreckage of a man who had tried to outlast the choir and failed. Before I left, he clutched my sleeve, his blind eyes wide with dread. They will sing your name again. And when they do, you must not answer. If you do. His words trailed into a sob. His body shook like a penitent under whip. You won't need a face anymore. I fled his cottage, the sound of his weeping chasing me into the night. But no matter how far I walked, I couldn't escape the truth that pressed against my chest. The choir hadn't finished with me. Episode 3. The faces that vanished from photographs. It began with the photographs. I was desperate to prove to myself that the choir was real, that Father Mercier's madness hadn't already spread to me. So I went to the town's tiny historical archive, a dust-choked room beneath City Hall, where photographs of baptisms, weddings, and choirs had been left to rot in boxes no one opened anymore. The archivist, a woman with trembling hands, seemed uneasy when I asked about St. Aurelia's. She muttered, "That church should be forgotten." But she gave me the box anyway, as if eager to pass on something that had weighed on her shelf too long. Inside, the photographs smelled of mildew and smoke. I pulled one free, a choir, 40 or 50 members, all dressed in immaculate robes, standing proudly on the steps of St. Aurelia's. At least their bodies were proud. Their faces were gone, not blurred, not scratched away, simply missing. Smooth skin where eyes and mouths should have been, like the flesh itself had obeyed some command to erase identity. My pulse quickened. I shuffled through the others. A wedding, the bride radiant in her gown, the groom smiling, but every guest behind them faceless. A funeral, the priest raising a hand in blessing, faceless. A baptism, the mother weeping over her infant, faceless. The only faces that remained were those who weren't part of the choir. I stared at a photo dated 1961. The caption on the back read, "St. Aurelia's Choir, Christmas Eve Mass." They stood in rows, holding hymnals, their blank faces tilted toward heaven. And though the photograph had no sound, my ears began to ring, faint and shrill, like the start of a note. I pressed my palms over my ears, but the sound didn't come from outside. It came from inside, just as Father Mercier had warned. The air grew cold, and then I noticed it. On the far edge of the photograph, half hidden in shadow, was a child. Not robed, not part of the choir. A little boy, no older than 10, clutching a hymnal too big for his hands. His face was clear, eyes wide, mouth parted in terror, as though he alone had seen what the camera captured. The ringing in my skull sharpened. I flipped to another photo. There he was again, standing in the corner of a wedding group, untouched, always staring toward the faceless choir. Then again, at the baptism. Then again, at a funeral. The same boy, the same face. The same fear, unchanged across decades. I dropped the photographs, my breath hitched. Someone whispered behind me. Not a voice, not exactly. More like the memory of a hymn. I turned, the room empty except for shelves and dust. But the photographs had scattered across the floor, all turned face up, all showing rows of faceless choirs. And on every single one, the little boy's eyes were now fixed not on them, but on me. Episode 4. The hymn that wrote itself on the walls. The first time I saw the words, they were written in dust. I had returned to St. Aurelia's, against every instinct screaming inside me, because the photographs had left me shaken beyond reason. I thought maybe if I stood in that church again, if I faced its silence, I could prove to myself that what I saw was only tricks of light, tricks of fear. But the church was not silent. The moment I pushed the door open, the air shivered. Not with voices this time, but with the residue of them, like echoes clinging to stone. The pews creaked as though they remembered the weight of those faceless bodies. And then I saw it, on the wall behind the altar, a hymn. Lines of music scratched into the surface, faint at first, as though drawn by a finger through dust. 5 lines, notes floating, lyrics scrawled beneath them. Words in Latin I could half recognize from old masses. Miserere nobis, have mercy on us. I stepped closer. My stomach turned. The words weren't written in dust at all. The strokes glistened, wet, dark. They smelled like iron, like blood. I reached out before I could stop myself. My fingertips touched the notes, still damp, still warm. The wall trembled, and suddenly the hymn erupted inside me, not in my ears, in my throat. My lips parted on their own, and I began to sing words I didn't know, to a melody I had never learned. My chest burned as if something clawed from within, forcing its way out through sound. The church shook. Dust fell from the rafters. Shadows stretched longer along the walls. I staggered back, choking, clutching my throat, but the hymn did not stop. It rose, louder, pouring from me in a voice that wasn't mine. My body was just the instrument. My terror was the air that carried it. And then, the faceless choir answered. From the loft above, they joined, their blank heads bowed, their harmony crashing against my voice until I felt myself unravel. Their song filled the church like a flood, pressing me down to my knees. But there was something worse. The lyrics changed. The blood-written hymn on the wall shifted, letters reshaping themselves even as I watched. The words bent into a prayer I understood clearly. Come closer. Join us. Erase the face. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the choir. The crucifix above the altar began to drip. Not wax, not water. Oil dark blood, spilling in time with the rhythm. The hymn demanded more, louder, louder, until I thought the stone itself would crack apart. And then silence. I collapsed to the floor, chest heaving, throat raw. The walls were clean. No words, no hymn, no blood. As if it had never been there. But I knew better, because the taste of iron lingered on my tongue. And in that silence I realized the choir hadn't just been singing to me. They had been singing through me. Episode 5, The Nun Who Lost Her Reflection. Her name was Sister Magdalene. At least, that's what the convent records said. No one remembered what she looked like anymore. I first heard about her from the archivist, the same woman who had given me the box of ruined photographs. Her voice shook when she told me there was a nun, one of the last who served at St. Aurelia's before the church was closed. She prayed more than anyone, sang louder than anyone, until the night she stopped having a face in the mirror. That story gnawed at me until I went looking for her. I found Sister Magdalene in a nursing home on the edge of town. The hallways smelled of bleach and old wool, and the nurses avoided her room, whispering that she prayed too loudly in the middle of the night. When I entered, she was seated by the window, hands wrapped tight around her rosary beads. The crucifix at the end had no Christ, just empty wood. "Do you hear them too?" she asked before I spoke a word. Her voice was papery, a breath more than a sound. I nodded, though the truth scared me. Her lips curved into something that wasn't a smile. "Then you'll understand what I lost." She pulled a mirror from the bedside drawer, an old cracked hand mirror. With trembling fingers she turned it toward herself. I saw it instantly. Her body was there. Her hands, the folds of her habit. But in the mirror, where her face should have been, nothing. Only a pale blur, like frost on glass. I stumbled back. She didn't flinch. "They took it," she whispered. "The night I sang too long. I wanted to serve God. I wanted to drown in His music. But it wasn't His choir. It was theirs. And when I finished, my reflection never came back." She set the mirror down. Her rosary beads rattled against the wood. "Without a reflection, you stop belonging to the world," she said. "You stop belonging to yourself. You are theirs, whether you wish it or not." Her voice cracked into a sob, then hardened. "I cover the mirror, but it doesn't matter. Every window, every pool of water, I see the choir standing behind me. Always behind me, faceless, waiting." Her fingers clawed at my wrist suddenly, gripped fierce with desperation. Her breath was hot against my ear as she whispered, "When they sing your name, don't answer. Promise me, promise me." I tore free from her grip, stumbling toward the door, but before I could leave, her voice rose, shrill and trembling, no longer a whisper but a hymn. And I swear to God, her song wasn't coming from her mouth. It came from the mirror. I fled, but the echo followed me down the hall, a hymn without lips, without breath, without mercy. And in that moment I understood. Losing your reflection was only the beginning. Episode 6, The Candle That Melted to a Voice. It began with a single flame. I had returned to St. Aurelia's again, though every visit left me weaker, thinner, as if the church consumed not just my courage, but my very flesh. That night I carried a candle, a simple white taper, blessed once by a priest who believed it would keep away shadows. Inside the church, the air was damp and stale, but I lit the candle anyway. Its glow flickered across broken pews and rotting hymnals. For a moment, I thought I was safe, bathed in light, holding fire against their darkness. Then the candle began to drip. Not normally, not in the slow and careless way wax falls. This was deliberate. Each drop landed with the precision of a heartbeat. 1, 2, 3, like a metronome guiding an unseen choir. And then the shape began to form. The wax didn't pool into a puddle. It stretched, curled, molded itself into something that froze my blood. Lips, pale, trembling lips, opening and closing at the base of the candle. The flame hissed, and from those wax lips, a voice slipped out. Thin, fragile, almost childlike. It whispered the beginning of a hymn I recognized too well. I dropped the candle. It clattered against the stone floor but didn't extinguish. The wax lips widened, singing louder, the sound filling the nave like a throat torn open to bleed music. I pressed my palms against my ears. It didn't matter. The voice slid past bone and skin, digging directly into my skull. The choir answered. From the loft above, faceless figures leaned forward, heads tilting in unison. Their silence was worse than their song, for it left space for the candle's voice to swell, to twist, to crawl into me. The lyrics warped, no longer Latin, no longer holy. Words bent into commands. Burn the tongue, burn the face, let the wax replace. The flame flared high, scorching the air, and I smelled flesh, not mine, not yet, but close. The crucifix above the altar cracked, bleeding wax instead of blood. Long rivulets slid down, dripping onto the stone floor where they hardened into pale faces. Blank, unfinished faces, each with a mouth struggling to sing. I stumbled back, kicking the candle away. Its flame died. Silence crushed the air. But when I looked down, the wax remained, shaped into lips still mouthing words, even without sound. I fled into the night, but as I ran, I swore I heard something behind me. My own voice, singing. Episode 7. The child who could repeat the choir. Children shouldn't know such songs. Not those songs. It was the librarian who told me about him, a boy from the orphanage near the edge of town. She whispered his story the way someone speaks of a plague, softly, fearfully, hoping it won't spread through the air. They say he hums the hymns from St. Aurelia's, she said. But no one ever taught him. Not one of us could have. Curiosity drove me there, though every step felt like betrayal of my own safety. The orphanage was a crumbling mansion, its windows boarded, its walls thin as paper. Children's laughter should have filled it. Instead, it sounded like a mausoleum. And then I heard it. A boy's voice, pure and steady, rising from the chapel room at the back. He sang with the precision of the faceless choir, without breath, without pause, as though every note had been carved into his bones. I pushed the door open. He stood alone by the altar, his small frame swallowed by rags too large for him. His eyes were shut, but his lips moved perfectly with the hymn I had heard that terrible night in St. Aurelia's. The same impossible harmony, the same weight in every note. When he finished, the silence rang louder than the song. Slowly, he opened his eyes. They were wide, unblinking, and terribly old. "They told me you would come," he said. I froze. "Who told you?" "The choir," he whispered. "They stand around my bed when I sleep. They put the songs in my mouth. They want me to teach the others." His gaze flicked to the shadows in the room. My skin crawled. I followed his eyes, and for a moment, I saw them. Faceless figures pressed into the corners, their heads bent toward him as though in blessing. The boy's lips trembled. "When I sing, they smile. I can't see it, but I feel it. Here." He pressed his hand to his chest. "And when I stop, they scream." I stepped forward, desperate, whispering, "You must stop. You must never sing their words again." His voice dropped to a whisper too soft to bear. "It's too late. I already taught one." The door creaked behind me. I turned. In the hallway, children stood. 10, 20, maybe more, all with mouths slightly open, humming a single note. The same note, their eyes glassy, their faces slack. The boy's small voice joined theirs, weaving their hum into harmony. The walls shook with the force of it. My chest locked. I realized then, this wasn't an orphanage anymore. It was a choir school. Episode 8, the sermon that ended in silence. I thought a priest's sermon was meant to guide, to comfort, to remind us of heaven. But the first sermon I heard inside St. Aurelia's in 50 years was nothing like that. Father Dominique was new to town, young, unscarred, full of that blazing faith only men untouched by darkness carry. He heard whispers of the abandoned church, the rumors of voices and shadows, and decided he would be the one to reclaim it for God. I sat in the back pew that night, my heart already heavy. He stood before a congregation of only a dozen, curious souls who should have stayed home. He opened the great Bible on the pulpit, its leather warped from damp, its pages brittle as dead leaves. "Tonight," he said, "this house will hear the word of the Lord again." But when he read aloud, it was not scripture. His lips formed verses, yes, but the sound was not his own. It was the choir, the faceless choir, spilling through his throat, bending holy words into hymns I had already heard in nightmares. The people shifted uneasily, their eyes darting to one another, unsure if they had misheard. Then the second verse came, and this time we all heard it. It wasn't in Latin, it wasn't in English, it was in something older, a language that gnawed at the edges of comprehension, a tongue that scraped across the soul instead of the ear. One by one the congregation fell silent. Not polite silence, not reverence, a crushing silence, heavy and unnatural, as though every voice in the room had been stolen in a single breath. I tried to speak, nothing came. My tongue felt carved from stone. Father Dominique's eyes widened. He was no longer in control. His hands gripped the pulpit, white-knuckled, but the sound kept pouring through him, louder, deeper, until the windows rattled in their frames. His face flushed red, veins bulging at his neck. Then his voice cracked and ended. The silence that followed was unbearable. Not a cough, not a shuffle, nothing. Every person in that church opened their mouths trying to scream, trying to pray, trying to beg, but no sound came out. We had been emptied. I stumbled forward, clutching the pew, staring at Father Dominique. His mouth still moved, but no sound escaped him either. His lips shaped a plea. "Help me." Behind him, the choir loft stirred. Faceless shadows leaned forward, as if savoring their harvest. The sermon had ended, not with amen, not with blessing, but with silence. And that silence followed us as we fled the church, heavy as a shroud. To this day, none of us who sat in that sermon can speak above a whisper. Our voices never came back whole. And I wonder if that was their intention all along. Episode 9. The Grave That Hummed. The earth should keep the dead quiet, but St. Aurelia's graveyard refused silence. It was Father Mercier who warned me never to step into the cemetery. "The choir doesn't stay in the church," he said once, his blind eyes clouded with terror. "Some of them still lie beneath the soil, but the soil cannot hold a song." I didn't believe him until the night I heard it for myself. The graveyard stretched behind the ruined chapel, its stones cracked, leaning, half swallowed by weeds. The moon hung low, and the mist clung to the ground like breath that refused to rise. I thought it would be silent there. I prayed for silence. Instead, I heard a vibration, low, constant, a hum that rose from the earth itself. It was faint at first, like the distant drone of bees, but as I stepped closer to one particular grave, it grew louder, clearer, until the stone trembled beneath my hand. The inscription was almost unreadable. Anna V., Choir Mistress, 1902. The hum swelled. I pressed my ear against the stone. What I heard froze the blood in my veins. It wasn't just sound, it was harmony. Voices weaving together, singing without breath, without words, filling the hollow dark beneath the earth. I staggered back. The ground pulsed, the soil shifting as though something pressed against it from below. Then came the rhythm, steady, insistent, the beat of a hymn, and with it a crack split across the gravestone. I fell to my knees as the hum deepened, vibrating through my bones. The earth itself seemed to chant. The crack widened, and soil spilled like sand from an hourglass. From inside the grave came not a hand, not a corpse, but a skull. It rolled against the edge of the grave, its jawless mouth forever sealed, and yet the sound poured from it, louder than ever. The hum became a note. The note became a hymn, and then impossibly the skull's blank sockets turned toward me. The choir answered. From all around, other graves joined in, stones shaking, earth splitting, voices layering into a hymn that shook the ground. The cemetery was no longer a place of rest. It was a cathedral, and the dead were its choir. I tried to run, but my legs buckled. The song burrowed inside me, pinning me to the ground. I clawed at my ears, screaming. But the sound wasn't entering from outside. It rose from the marrow of my bones. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The graves lay still. The mist settled. The skull returned to silence. But when I looked down at my own hands, they were trembling, not from fear, but from rhythm. My fingers tapped against my thigh without permission, beating the same pattern I had heard beneath the earth. The song hadn't ended. It had only moved inside me. Episode 10. The organist who played without fingers. An organ should not play itself, and yet St. Aurelia's had never obeyed the rules of the living. It happened on a night when the mist rolled thick, and the moon was little more than a smudge behind clouds. I had returned to the chapel, drawn like a moth to the same flame that burned me every time. The silence inside was unbearable, too still, too expectant, like the air itself held its breath. Then I heard it, a single note, deep and trembling, echoing from the choir loft. The organ. Its pipes had long been rusted, keys broken, bellows torn. It should have been impossible. And yet, the melody crept down the rafters, hesitant at first, then building, louder, bolder, until the church itself shuddered. I climbed the stairs, each step groaning beneath my weight, and there, seated at the organ, was a man, or what remained of one. He wore a choir robe, frayed with age, his head bowed over the keys, his hands rested against the ivory. But he had no fingers, only stumps, smooth and pale, pressing soundless against the keys. And still, the music rose, perfect, flawless, carrying the same impossible harmony I had heard in the choir's Faceless song. I froze. His shoulders lifted as if he breathed with the music, but his chest never moved. When he finally turned his head toward me, I understood the truth. He had no face, blank flesh where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. Yet his body swayed with devotion, his mutilated hands playing music that poured not from the organ, but from somewhere deeper, older. The hymn twisted, the notes curved into shapes that scraped against the soul, vibrating my teeth, rattling the marrow in my bones. My throat convulsed. I almost sang along without meaning to. And then the music changed. The organist pounded the keys harder, though his stumps never truly touched them. The pipes screamed, their rust cracking, dust falling like ash. I dropped to my knees, clutching my ears. But the hymn had chosen me. A dozen faceless figures appeared around the organ, robes shifting like shadows. They leaned forward, their heads tilting as though listening closely. Then, in perfect unison, they opened mouths they did not have and joined the song. The sound swelled until the very walls cracked. The crucifix trembled, bleeding waxy tears. My body burned with the rhythm, every vein pulsing in time with the organ's roar. And just when I thought I would shatter, the organist stopped. The silence was like a blade across my throat. I gasped, trembling, and when I looked back, the organ bench was empty. No faceless man, no broken hands, only keys, dented and stained, as if something had burned itself into them. And when I stumbled back down the stairs, I realized my own hands ached. My fingers twitched, curling as if remembering a song I had never learned. It struck me then. The choir wasn't only taking voices, it was taking hands too. Episode 11. The prayer that summoned the choir. Some prayers bring peace, others bring answers. But that night, the prayer brought the choir. I was not alone. A small circle of believers, foolish, desperate, or both, had gathered in the ruins of St. Aurelia's. They had heard the same whispers I had, that prayers spoken at midnight could call down miracles. None of them knew what kind of miracle we were inviting. We knelt on the broken stone floor. Our breaths clouded the air, the only warmth in that frozen nave. A woman began first, her voice trembling as she recited the Lord's Prayer. Another joined, then another, until all voices blended in fragile unison. For a moment it was beautiful, human, weak but alive. Then the church answered. The echo did not return our words, it bent them. The syllables came back darker, drawn out, reshaped into notes. Our prayer had become a hymn I knew, a hymn that was not ours. The candles flickered violently, their flames bowing toward the choir loft as if pulled by unseen breath. And then they arrived. Faceless figures descended from the loft, robes dragging across the broken floor, their heads tilting in grotesque reverence. They formed a circle around us, mirroring our posture, kneeling with hands clasped in mock devotion. The woman beside me gasped, clutching her rosary, but no sound escaped her throat. Her lips moved, but the words were stolen before they reached the air. The choir began to sing. It was not loud. That was the terror. Their song was soft, almost tender, weaving through the silence like smoke. But each note pressed against my skull. Each word burrowed into my chest, shaping itself into meanings I did not want to understand. Kneel deeper. Pray louder. Give us the breath you do not need. My lungs tightened. The circle of believers collapsed one by one, coughing, clawing at their throats. Their prayers turned into nothing but silence. Their voices leached into the choir's song. I tried to stand, but hands gripped my shoulders, cold, boneless, unyielding. One of the faceless figures leaned close, its blank head almost touching mine, and though it had no mouth, I felt its words vibrate inside my skull. Say amen. I refused, my lips sealed shut. My chest screamed for air, but I held it until my vision darkened. Then, the hymn faltered. The figures stilled, tilting their heads in something like disappointment. One by one, they rose and drifted back toward the loft, their robes dissolving into shadow. The circle was broken. The believers lay sprawled on the floor, their eyes wide, their mouths open, silent forever. I crawled out of the church, every breath ragged, every heartbeat thunderous, and I realized the truth. Prayers did not summon God in St. Aurelia's. They only fed the choir. Episode 12. The choir that sang my name. It began quietly, like the murmur of wind through broken glass. I thought the voices had left me. Weeks had passed since the prayer circle was silenced, and I convinced myself that maybe the choir had found new prey. Maybe for once I had escaped. But then, on a night when the air was heavy and the moon a thin blade in the sky, I heard it. A hymn, low, familiar, rising from nowhere and everywhere at once. And this time it wasn't the faceless choir singing to heaven. They were singing to me. The first note trembled like a thread pulled tight in my chest. Then came the words, clear, perfect, undeniable. My name, drawn out, each syllable stretched into melody, carved into the air like scripture. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. They sang it again, louder. The sound vibrated against the walls of my room, though no one was there. My shadow wavered on the plaster, bending in ways the candle did not cause. I pressed my palms over my ears. Useless. The hymn rose inside me, shaking my bones, drumming in my veins, echoing from the hollows of my skull. I staggered to the mirror, and that's when I saw them. Behind me, the choir. Dozens of faceless figures robed in darkness, their heads bowed as though in worship. Not in the mirror's reflection alone. No. They crowded the room itself. I could feel their robes brushing against my skin, their presence suffocating the air. Their song swelled and every voice chanted my name. Stop, I begged, my lips trembling, but my voice was devoured instantly, swallowed by their harmony. My name drowned me, echoing from all directions. A chorus of possession. And then, something worse. My own voice joined them. Without my consent, my throat opened and I sang. My name, woven into their song, repeated endlessly, a perfect harmony with the faceless. The sound was beautiful, terrifying, eternal. Tears burned down my face. I clawed at my throat, but it didn't stop. The more I resisted, the louder my voice grew, until it became indistinguishable from theirs. The crucifix above my bed cracked. Splinters fell like rain. The walls shuddered, plaster bleeding faint lines of crimson that formed the shape of notes. My name written in blood, strung into a hymn across the room. And then, in one final burst, the song ended. The silence slammed into me, heavier than the sound. My knees buckled. I collapsed, gasping, throat raw. When I dared to lift my eyes, the choir was gone. But the mirror wasn't empty. I saw myself, lips moving soundlessly, eyes hollow, face pale. And though no sound came from the glass, I knew exactly what it was singing. My name. Episode 13. The crucifix that bled to the rhythm. A crucifix should be a symbol of mercy. But mercy had long abandoned St. Aurelia's. I returned to the chapel not out of faith, but out of desperation. After nights of hearing my own name sung in endless echoes, I needed to know if the church still held its power, or if it had already claimed me as its own. The moonlight bled through shattered windows as I stepped inside. The air was thick, heavy with mildew and ash. And then I saw it, the great crucifix above the altar, leaning forward as though burdened by some unseen weight. At first it was silent, still. Then came the drop. A single bead of crimson fell from Christ's carved hand, striking the stone floor with a sound too loud for liquid. Another followed, and another. Soon, rivulets of blood streamed down the wooden figure, dripping in time with a rhythm I recognized instantly. A hymn. The crucifix was bleeding to the choir's song. I staggered back, but the rhythm only grew louder. Every drop of blood hit the ground like a drumbeat, and from above, the faceless choir leaned forward, their heads tilting in unison. They weren't singing, not yet. They were waiting. The crucifix groaned, its wooden body splitting, blood pouring in steady cadence. My ears rang as the rhythm filled the church, the sound vibrating through my ribs. I realized with a sick twist in my stomach that the blood wasn't random. It was spelling something. On the stone floor where the droplets fell, words formed in thick, dark lines. "Join us." I choked on my breath. My knees trembled. The crucifix trembled harder. Blood cascading now in rivers, splattering across the altar. The rhythm swelled into a full hymn, and at last, the faceless choir began to sing. Their harmony merged with the dripping blood until the church itself pulsed like a living organ. Every brick, every beam, shook with music. My heart struggled to keep its own rhythm. It wanted to beat with theirs. Then the impossible happened. The eyes of the crucifix opened. Blood spilled from them like tears, and Christ's mouth stretched wide, splitting the wood as though even he had joined their song. The sound that followed wasn't divine. It was a roar of agony, of eternity, of every voice ever stolen. I fell to my knees, clutching my ears, but it was too late. The hymn carved itself into me, slicing through bone and marrow. My pulse aligned with the dripping crucifix, each heartbeat pounding "Join us" into my skull. I screamed until my throat shredded, and then silence. The crucifix was whole again, no cracks, no blood, only dry wood hanging lifeless above the altar. But when I staggered outside, shaking, I felt it, my heart still beating, not in my rhythm, but in theirs. And with every throb of blood in my veins, I knew the truth. I was already part of the song. Episode 14. The choir without faces walked in. Until that night, they had always stayed above me, perched in the loft, hidden in shadows, distant. But faceless things don't belong in distance. They belong beside you. The chapel was already alive before I entered, air humming, windows trembling in their frames. I knew I should have turned back, but my feet carried me to the front pew, as though dragged on invisible strings. Silence fell, thick, suffocating. And then the loft stirred. Dozens of robed figures leaned forward, their blank faces glinting in the candlelight that hadn't been there a moment ago. For the first time, they did not sing, they simply stood, waiting. Then in one motion they began to descend. Step by step, their feet struck the wooden stairs, and with each step, the ground quaked. Dust rained from the rafters. My chest locked, breath frozen as I realized what was happening. The choir was walking into the nave, into the world of the living. I tried to rise, but I couldn't move. My body obeyed their rhythm, every muscle tightening in time with their measured steps. They formed a circle around me, robes brushing the stone, heads bowed, faceless gazes burning into my skin. And then they sang. Not the high, haunting hymns of before. This was low, guttural, like the earth itself had a voice. The walls bled dust, the crucifix swayed, and the hymn wrapped around me like chains. The words weren't foreign anymore. I understood them. Erase the breath, erase the face, erase the name. I felt my lips move, my throat strained. My own voice joined theirs, unwilling, dragged from me like marrow from bone. My name dissolved into their harmony, each syllable stolen and twisted. The figures drew closer. One touched my shoulder, skin cold, rubbery, inhuman. Another brushed my cheek with a hand that felt both solid and empty. I looked up, desperate, and saw it. The first crack forming in my reflection on the stained glass window. My face blurring, smearing, as though already being rewritten. The choir's song swelled and the crucifix above dripped again. Not blood, not wax, but black ink, splattering the floor in patterns I almost recognized. Notes, measures, a hymn composed with my life. I screamed, or thought I did. The sound never left my lips. It was swallowed, fed into their harmony. And then, every faceless figure raised its head. They looked at me, and for the first time, I knew what it meant to be chosen. The hymn stopped. The silence was heavier than death. And in that silence, one thought burned inside me like fire. If they had walked into my world, it meant there was only one place left for me to go. Into theirs. Episode 15. The last song that erased the church. It began with a single note. A low hum that rattled the pews, cracked the glass, and bent the air itself. I knew, deep in my marrow, that it was the end. The choir had sung every name but mine, and now they had come to finish their hymn. The faceless figures surrounded me in the nave. Their robes rippled without wind, their blank heads tilted in unison. The crucifix above the altar trembled violently, bleeding not blood, not wax, not ink, but light. Thick, searing light that spilled like liquid fire. Then the choir began. Their voices rose as one, louder than storms, deeper than earth. The sound wasn't music anymore. It was destruction. The hymn clawed through stone, tearing cracks into the very walls of St. Aurelia's. Windows burst inward, shards spinning like glass confetti in a wedding gone wrong. I fell to my knees, clutching my chest, my heartbeat trapped inside the rhythm of their song. Every pulse carried their words. Erase, erase, erase. The floor split open. From the fissures, more figures climbed out, faceless, robed, endless, singing as they emerged. The ground itself became their stage, the church their throat, the world their instrument. And then the crucifix screamed. Not Christ, not wood, but the thing behind it, the truth hidden inside it. A roar of agony and ecstasy, a voice older than faith. The light from its wounds flooded the church, consuming walls, pews, and ceiling in a white blaze. The hymn swelled, reaching its final chord. I knew then, the last song wasn't meant to be heard. It was meant to erase. The choir's faceless heads turned to me. My reflection on the shattered glass showed nothing but blur, my features dissolving like wet paint. My voice ripped free from my throat, weaving into theirs until I could no longer tell where I ended and they began. The church convulsed. The hymn reached its climax. And then silence. The light swallowed everything. Stone, wood, shadow, gone. St. Aurelia ceased to exist. When I opened my eyes, there was no church, no choir, no crucifix. Only a flat stretch of earth under a starless sky. My body trembled. But when I touched my face, I felt nothing, smooth, blank, and then I understood. The church had not been destroyed. It had been absorbed. I was inside it now. Around me, the faceless choir turned, robes shifting, heads bowed. Together, we opened mouths we did not have, and the first note rose. The last song had erased the church. Now the world was next.
Epilogue, the hymn that still remains. They tell me, Aurelia's never stood here, that the ground has always been empty. But I remember the church. I remember the cracked pews, the bleeding crucifix, the faceless choir. I remember the night the hymn grew so loud it erased stone and memory alike. And still, when the wind moves just right, when the world tilts into silence, I hear it. A faint harmony, threaded through the air, hidden in the hum of power lines, in the murmur of restless sleep. A hymn without breath, without pause. If you listen too closely, you may hear your name in it. And if you answer, you'll never need a face again.